It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey Not the Face with your host John Nash and your producer me, Steffi Haynes, and we have quite a bit of news this week to take a look at. For everything from Dana White's new position with Meta, Donn Davis giving us a list of 5 problems that PFL was hindered with, but none of them were PFL's fault. I mean, Joe Rogan is out here talking about John Jones wanting $30 million to fight Tom Aspinall. There is so much news going on. But first, we're going to check in with John and see how his new year was.
New Year's was fine. It's everything around New Year's. I'm dying over here, Steph. I'm dying over here. You're killing me. Not you personally, but the life in general.
The weather's got to be getting you.
The weather's terrible. And I got my mom, who I love, but yeah. There's a truism: as they get older, they become children. And my God, she's a child now. So I got that to deal with. So have everybody say a prayer for me. You know, even if you're an atheist, I don't know what, say a prayer to the gods at the tech bros in Silicon Valley or something, and pray for me, because I don't know if I'm going to make it to the holiday season.
You're going to make it. You're going to make it. Yeah. I'm praying to Jobu right now. Remember him from Major League?
Major League.
Yeah.
Yep, Jobu.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to get right into this show, because there's a lot of information that we need to unpack, and we're going to go ahead and get started. And my first order of business is Donn Davis. Now, he went over to his LinkedIn. I mean, who still posts on LinkedIn? But anyways, he went to LinkedIn yesterday and he made a post that basically talked about the 5 problems that hindered the PFL in 2024. What I want you to do, John, is take it one number at a time, break it down, and give your educated opinion on what he's saying there. If it seems valid to you, if it doesn't, and what are your thoughts on how maybe they could fix each one?
Well, first I want to note something Jonathan at Kowloon said. How much better Chatri is it, like LinkedIn posts, than Donn Davis is, at least when targeted towards MMA fans. He writes stuff that's BS, but it's inspirational to the martial arts fans, right? It has that almost like cult-like value, appealing to martial arts fans, like you are in something bigger. Where Donn Davis, I don't know who he's writing this for, but it obviously doesn't appeal to MMA fans. Just, which is weird to say that Chatri's better at something. That is a weird thing to say, but that's true. But anyways, to go through, starting at number 1, numerous potential new investors wasted thousands of hours of our time, and time is so precious. Yes, time is precious. That is true. I don't know what investors he's talking about and how they wasted their time, but that's part of the business, I thought, when you have a startup, is trying to raise money and dealing with investors. So you should pipe in on this, Stephanie, whenever you hear something that you find especially egregious.
I think they're all egregious, if you want my opinion. It seems to me that Donn Davis just ran off a list of things that either should be acceptable in the business, but he doesn't take any blame for any single thing. It is all everyone else's fault. But number 3 is the one that really got me. Number 3 is terrible, but I'm going to let you continue.
Yeah, okay, number 2, we're going to get to number 3. We're building up. That's the big suspense one there. Number 2, major new advertiser agreed to deal, was in final contract, and then new management came in and stopped deal. Now, this is common. You see this in the film industry and stuff a lot, that there's a project greenlit, new execs come in, they cancel all the projects from the previous person. And so it's a common occurrence. And the first 2 I can understand being annoyed with, but I don't know why you would air that out to the public as bad things happen and survived. It's not like, we, the public, or even people in the business, because I think this is being directed more to people in the industry, or I shouldn't say in the industry, not the MMA industry, but, investors and venture capitalists and just the business community. But I'm sure all those people have had these problems, and I don't know why they would rate these very high. This to me would just be like all the troubles all the other companies had. New investors wasted our time, and an advertiser, new management dropped an advertising deal. It's like it's a throwaway line, but to be ranked seems just kind of absurd to me. So that's those two. But then we get to number 3. Here's the big one. Here's what we've been waiting for. Some Bellator star fighters complained on social media about not fighting, making PFL look like not meeting our contracts. Does this post? You could spend the time to work on the grammar of it, because it's not making PFL look like not meet our contracts. That is not a proper sentence. So, and there's also, he has no periods at the end of these sentences, I've noticed either. So there's a lot of work to be done there. But anyways, not to mock him too much, but this one is hilarious because, of course, it's the Bellator starfighters' fault for complaining, making them look bad, and not their fault for not getting them the fights.
How dare they?
How dare you?
How dare those fighters complain that they can't make their ends meet when they're put on the shelf so that Donn Davis can flaunt around their name value and never give them a fight? How dare they make Donn Davis and the PFL look bad like that?
Yeah, and this again, it's just such a weird framing of these things that politically, if you're trying to appeal to the MMA fan base, there's ways you could kind of shape these answers that would be less offensive to MMA fans. You could talk about like, oh, it was a trying year. We absorbed Bellator, running into some difficulties. We've been trying to make, some of the fighters have not been happy, but we are doing the best we can to honor their contracts and do as good as we can for them. That would go much longer than saying it's those whiners' fault.
Yes.
Right?
That's the vibe I got too. Exactly what you said, those whiners.
But also, if you're paying attention to MMA at all, it does look like you're directing the blame. You're intentionally, it seems obvious that you're trying to direct the blame towards them instead of giving a more honest portrayal of what the situation is. And we should ask, if every fighter is complaining that they're not getting their fights, and we can look at the number of Bellator events this year. We can look at the number of fights they had, all those things. It seems apparent by just counting them, how many fighters only had one fight, no fight this year. Obviously, there's a large number of fighters wanting to get fights and not getting them. And so I don't know how PFL is trying to frame it like, oh, we did our job and it's the Bellator fighters, the star fighters are complaining. And the other complaint I hear people say, oh, it's the previous management at Bellator. Scott Coker signed into all these agreements. First, Pitbull, who's complaining, his agreement was signed several years ago. So this was not something that was ran through at the end. The other thing is they did do due diligence. There was a whole due diligence process. Remember, that took months for them to go through it. They had to know all the contracts that fighters signed. You can't sneak in a contract and not reveal it to them, because then you'd be violating due diligence on the Showtime side. So they knew that these fighters had these contracts, and yet they still pushed through the deal. So it doesn't seem like a reasonable defense to say, oh, these fighters came on these deals that were just unrealistic, that were pushed through by Bellator. You knew that when you got the company, and you have to honor those agreements. Yeah. And it doesn't seem like they're honoring them, except, of course, it looks like all the Bellator fighters are just complainers. So maybe it is their fault.
It seems like they're only making fights when things get out of hand. Like when Corey Anderson started piping up, they were quick to give him a fight. And it looks like Aaron Pico might have gotten something too, but we'll get to that in a minute. What do you think of the next ones?
Well, the next one is, we are growing so fast with our new international leagues that costs in some regional areas are way too high. Now, actually, this one sounds reasonable to me, as funny as it is. It is a joke. We are growing so much. But they have expanded wildly, right? They've expanded in Europe. They've done Middle East, North Africa. They're doing Africa now. So they're expanding rapidly in these franchises that they're doing. And so might be incurring much higher costs than originally planned. All that sounds very reasonable. So, on one hand, it's a humble brag. We are growing so fast. But it's also a truth. This is the one that sounds the most accurate portrayal of what might be going on. They're expanding so much in these regions and they're spending way too much. And then number 5, finally, major new initiative and expansion is delayed one full year by one of our partners, though no fault to PFL. And I'm not 100%. Do you know what he's referring to there?
I do not. I have no idea. The only partners I could think of were the Saudis.
Yeah. So are they talking about the, were they talking about the Bellator merger? Are they talking about the global league structure they were planning? I'm not sure what it is. If we don't even know what the initiative expansion thing is, I don't know why you bring it up, because I'm not blaming you for it, because I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
Again, it's strange to say, but Jonathan Colon is correct. Kotri seems better at these LinkedIn type posts.
Let's continue on with Donn Davis. I mentioned this earlier, but he says that PFL offered Aaron Pico a major contract and title fight. Now, what makes Aaron Pico and Corey Anderson, because as far as I know, those are the only two that they've given a fight to that have been piping up really loud. But what makes Aaron Pico and Corey Anderson so special amid all the complaints of all the other top Bellator fighters that aren't getting booked?
Well, I think one of it, Aaron Pico might be at the end of his contract, is one of my guess. He's not also a title holder. Oh, the other thing too is I think one thing that they weight PFL really high, and it sounds absurd, but they really weight the fighters that are ranked in the Fight Matrix rankings, the higher they are, because we've talked about, that's a huge selling point they make on their lender decks and in the interviews that Donn Davis do. They stress how many ranked Fight Matrix fighters they have and how that compares to the UFC. And so the ones that they seem more intent on retaining, right, seem to be the ranked guys, the high ranked guys. And Pico, though I think he is ranked by Fight Matrix, is not as high as others. He probably has limited fights left. It's probably true too. They offered him a title fight and a big contract by, the MMA terms, probably bigger than the standard UFC contract for a guy in a similar position. Because that's, Bellator used to have to pay that too as well. But the problem is right now, one is, what's the title fight? Is he going to fight for a Bellator belt that doesn't mean anything anymore? Is there any prestige in a Bellator belt anymore? Title? Is there prestige in a PFL title? Do you want that title if it comes with a championship clause that extends the contract? So that's one. I'm sure he did not. The title doesn't mean much to him. It has no prestige anymore to him. And two, why do I want my contract extended? And then the other thing is, we just went through a period where you were not giving fighters fights, and maybe PFL is economically on sound footing with they're well financed. They don't have to worry about anything. But when you're not offering fights, and the history of MMA says that promotions start struggling, they disappear, right? For all practical purposes, we can say one has basically disappeared as an MMA promotion. But, Elite XC, Affliction, all of them, when they ran into troubles, the promotion collapsed and you're left in limbo. Why then, Aaron Pico is probably thinking, him as management, why do I want to sign on? Because there's no guarantee I will get the fights that I sign on to here.
Food for thought there. One last thing with Donn Davis. Today, he announced that PFL is finally allowing elbows. Twofold question here. Is this gesture a little bit too late, too little, too late? And is there anything else or anything more that they can do? Like this, fan-wise, promotional-wise, like true promotional-wise, is there anything more they can do to sort of right the ship?
Too little, too late. I wouldn't say that, because it depends. If they can continue the promotion for a while, all will be forgiven. People will forget they didn't have elbows. And also, when you do a season-based structure with a tournament at the end, no elbows make some sense, because it does cause more cuts, which they have concern that will make it more likely a fighter cannot continue. So in a structure format, it makes sense not allowing elbows, and it doesn't bother me that they didn't there. But the problem is, no one really cares about a season. No one cares about that structure of the general fan. It might get some interest, some way to follow lesser known fighters, up and coming fighters, things like that. But fans generally like events with well-known fighters and big fights. That's the thing that's going to sell. So the big thing PFL could do is get more well-known fighters and put them in big fights. But that's the catch-22 that every promotion runs into when the UFC has a monopoly, as we're doing lawsuits over that, over all the top fighters. So PFL, the number one thing, the seasons are fine as kind of a feeder system for their own promotion, but they need to put on more big events that have more attractive, more important, more interesting fights. And the whole thing will come down to, after the UFC signs their next deal, depending on where they go, it'll all come down to early next year for PFL. All will be forgiven if they can go out. At least all will be forgiven by his investors, probably. I don't know if all will be forgiven by the fans, but all will be forgiven if they can go out and sign the big TV broadcasting deal they expect now that UFC is going to sign something. So everything's building up to then. They just have to survive another 18 months or so and hopefully get a big deal, and then they can cash out. But until then, it's not too little too late if they can get another deal and survive. But if they don't get that deal, then it might, then there are probably going to be a lot of questions. Why didn't you do certain things much earlier?
Do you think if they don't get a good broadcast deal, they're going to sell out to the Saudis or somebody like that? If
the Saudis will have them. I mean,
yeah.
the problem with PFL right now, they're selling on promise of what they're, the growth projections and how they're going. The primary source of revenue is probably the Saudis putting events on in the Middle East. So that's their primary source of revenue. And so the whole thing is, can they get a broadcast deal that pays something? If, let's say, UFC signs with Netflix and ESPN, but ESPN has a limited number of events and they want to fill up Fight Pass with more events to keep fans subscribed for MMA, they might come to, PFL and say, here is $90 million, which would be a massive deal for a non-UFC promotion, $90 million per year, throwing the Saudi money, and now you're talking mid 150 million or so, give or take, for total revenue. Well, you pay the fighters a third more than the UFC does, but not all of it. There's still going to be enough to have profit at that point. And so the investors, they can probably unload the promotion or make their money back at that point. But if they can't get that deal, PFL looks like it's dead in the water by the time it gets to the time to negotiate that deal, and they're offered much, much less or nothing, then I don't know how they continue, because they have an incredible burn rate. Even with the increased revenue from the Saudis, they still spend a lot of money per year. And before, 2 years ago, they were burning through something like up to 50 million a year, close to one level. So they don't have endless amount of money to do that. They definitely need something that's going to stabilize them, and a big TV deal would do that. And so the whole thing comes down to them. Can they get a TV deal and then some other gravy with sponsors and foreign franchising and stuff like that? But the TV deal is going to be key to keeping them around.
One last quick question. You said something earlier that caught my ear. You referred to PFL as a startup. This far in, are they really a startup?
Well, they sort of. I mean, look at Uber and Lyft and stuff. How for years, Uber's still losing money, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they've been around for years and years. And so, yeah, technically, PFL started the World Series of Fighting, but as they're launching as the PFL, the whole point is they had on the horizon, they had a plan. They're raising capital to get to that. They are not, until they reach the point where they negotiate a TV deal, they're not in a spot where they would make due on making returns at all. So I would still look at them as a startup, but 18 months from now, they're no longer a startup. We know when the startup era ends. The startup era ends. They're no longer a startup after they negotiate that next TV deal.
All right. Let's talk UFC now. Joe Rogan. We have to consider the source here, but Joe Rogan is the source. He said that he heard Jon Jones is seeking $30 million to fight Tom Aspinall, and that the UFC is steadfastly working on making this happen. Once again, considering the source isn't always the most stable. What do you make of this?
Well, first off, I'm pretty sure Joe Rogan got this from a guy on Twitter who I can't remember his name, did not follow his account. I'm not a fan of his account, but he's a notorious troll. And I think he made it up, and Joe Rogan, of course, believed it. Now let's pretend he didn't get it from that guy. Let's pretend that he got it from legitimate sources within the UFC. I doubt it, but let's say he did, right? I think Joe Rogan, I think he did. He saw someone repeated that tweet and he believed it, but let's pretend he heard it somewhere else. John Jones may be seeking 30 million. Remember, that was famously is what he supposedly was seeking to fight Ngannou.
Yes.
That number is believable. That's something that John Jones wants. The UFC doesn't come close to paying it last time. I doubt they come close this time. The idea that the UFC is going to pay that much money, well beyond what they paid before, doesn't match the history of the UFC. That is money they're just going to blow, and it's going to set a level that other fighters are going to want. Now, it's conceivable, like we talked about in Ngannou. One way to make the Ngannou fight, if he signs back to the UFC, if remember when Turkey says he hinted he's going to make that fight, John Jones versus Francis Ngannou. One way Turkey Al-Sheikh could do it is get a sponsorship patch and sponsor the fighters, right? And pay them like 10 extra million above and beyond what the UFC would pay them to get them to do it. Now that's possible. If they go to Saudi Arabia and the Riyadh season and does some endorsement deal with John Jones to make it happen, maybe then it happens. But the UFC, their bottom line, their business plan is they're a repeat player. They are not going to change the model for anybody, not John Jones. They haven't changed it. They never changed it for Conor McGregor. You see all these fans repeating the numbers Conor McGregor tells you about how much money he's making, but that we know that's not what Conor McGregor made. We know from the lawsuit, we know from other sources. And Conor McGregor, as much as he makes well beyond all other UFC fighters, the amount he generates, he does not get beyond the percentage that the UFC sets aside for fighters. It's the same basically percentage that the UFC pays other fighters. So that's one. And then the other thing is, for this deal is the UFC is basically on a flat pay-per-view deal. And so every event they weigh the revenue for that event. So the gate might be huge, but it's still going to get the same 20 million. You're going to get basically the same closed circuit because they sell the bars in advance, basically the same sponsorship money, except a little extra maybe that they get for their events because you sponsor UFC and money spread across multiple events, the losers and the winners. So them paying 30 million just takes away from the revenue this one event would make and hurts their bottom line. So it's good to point out that Joe Rogan is not the best source. And I do know too, it's interesting for Joe Rogan to be a speaker of the truth. You ever notice how very little he's willing to speak the truth, the power about the UFC's pay to their fighters? He'll say little things like, oh, I want the fighters to get paid more. But he'll never go and say, my God, they really ripped this guy off considering how much he generated.
Yeah, he's real vocal when he doesn't agree with judges or with what a ref is doing, but forget it. If the UFC is ripping off fighters, he's looking the other way. He's, walking the other way down the street, something. It's never in the same room with Joe Rogan.
Good thing is John Jones is going to get 30 million because Joe Rogan read it on a Twitter account that makes up stuff.
Remember, Dana White said, John Jones wants Deontay Wilder money. I'll never forget that. He called $30 million Deontay Wilder money.
Yeah, and the truth, and John Jones claimed he did not, didn't John Jones say release the tweets?
Yeah.
Or not tweets, the text messages.
Yeah.
Because apparently John Jones didn't ask for that. John Jones wanted, my understanding was he was asking for like 15 million guaranteed and then a cut that would give him 30 million on what they expected the event to do. So it wasn't like he wanted 30 million guaranteed. But you know what, fans, but John Jones was just that's just greedy, trying to dodge Ngannou.
Dana White, let's talk about him for a second because a big announcement came out today, straight from the mouth of Mark Zuckerberg. He said that Dana White is now joining Meta's board of directors. Why in the world does Meta want Dana White on their board? To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Okay, the face!